So I wanted to just step back real quick and talk about why we're really using YAML files, and there's two big reasons. The first is that it's language independent. So we can use YAML with PHP, but YAML can also be used for JavaScript. It can be used for Objective-C. It can be used for any programming language that cares to write a parser for it. Now, the value of that is twofold. The first is that we can learn YAML as a storage format and allow that knowledge and practice to carry over to other programming languages if we want to. Now, the second big benefit of using YAML, why we're using YAML, is that it provides a decoupling of configuration and code. And another way to phrase this decoupling is separation of concerns. Now, if you've worked in web development at all, you've seen separation of concerns before. You might not have recognized it as an illustration of this principle, but the idea is that if we can identify the different groups of people that are going to want to do different things with our application, then we should separate out the different areas that they work in. And that will allow them to make changes to their domain, to their area of the application, without adversely affecting other parts of it. So one really good example of this is HTML and CSS. So it's very easy to write HTML and CSS in line with one another. We can use the style parameter inside of an HTML tag to style it the way we want. We can make it red. We can change the background to an animated GIF. Like, we can do all kinds of things right there in the HTML. And if we're the only person that's going to be working with that code, then maybe that's not too difficult to understand. There might actually be benefits to having those two things sort of right next to another, so we can see that we don't have to do any digging to find that out. But as soon as there's more than one person working on an application, that combination of concerns becomes problematic. Because now, let's say we have someone who's an HTML expert and then another person who's a CSS expert. The HTML expert might be editing the HTML code to make it more accessible to people with disabilities, for example. But along the way, they're having to deal with this embedded CSS, and they're not really sure what they should take out, what they should put in. They don't know if they're duplicating something that already exists. It's not their domain. And wouldn't it be nicer if they could just work with the HTML without having to think about the other aspects that they're not an expert in? Well, and then we have our CSS expert, who knows how to craft CSS to make something look just perfect in multiple browsers, across browsers, and they're very careful about that CSS. And if that CSS is in the HTML and somebody's just arbitrarily changing that, not on purpose, but just because they're working in that same area of the code, and they're changing the CSS as part of that process, then it becomes harder for them to do their job. So that's why it makes sense to separate CSS files from HTML files and have them be two completely separate things. It's a separation of concerns. Now, on the surface, that seems like a fair enough reason to separate things out. But ultimately, that separation leads to the ability to do things that we couldn't normally do if those two concerns were too tightly coupled. So for example, now we can refactor our CSS and reuse certain components and use CSS preprocessors in order to make sure that those CSS files are tight and compressed and they're not going to be a big file download. That kind of thing, though, wouldn't be possible if the CSS was embedded in the HTML. So that whole separation of concerns idea, if we apply that to YAML, has similar patterns of benefits. What we're doing is taking parts that would normally be embedded in code. We just did that. We took parts that were embedded in our app.php file that define the routes, and we pulled them out into a YAML file. So that part that was in code that required code in order to be processed at all now doesn't require any code at all. We can actually have somebody who is an expert at defining routes work on the routes.yml file without having to deal with any code at all. And there are so many places across Drupal where configuration was embedded in code, where it felt like we could apply a YAML style pattern and pull that configuration out into a file. So in Drupal 8, you see a lot of YAML files, and they cover all sorts of grounds. There's routing YAML files, there's services YAML files, there's YAML files for configuration, things that we would normally cram into a variable set. We can now define those things inside of YAML files. And so it's a pattern that makes sense, that is repeatable, that applies to lots of different aspects of Drupal. And while that separation of concerns allows us to work independently on different parts of Drupal, that's not the only benefit. We also get the ability to parse out those YAML files in a standard way across the board. So instead of having configuration embedded in arrays that have different structures, or maybe inside of variable calls like variable set, we instead pull all those things out into a single unified format. And that's only possible because of that separation of concerns. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm trying to get you excited about YAML because you're going to be using it so much in Drupal 8. And at first, it can seem a little arbitrary that we're using it for particular things, but as you start to get used to the pattern, you really start to understand where it makes things easier and sustainable